I saw my mother do something no one would believe. My brother survived. What we did next, no one expected. My name is Elder Rose Miller. I'm 73 years old. And although it's hard for me to walk in the mornings and sometimes I don't remember where I left my keys, there is something that remains intact in my memory. That afternoon when my father tried to kill my brother, Thomas. This isn't an exaggeration. He buried him believing he had killed him, that he was no longer breathing. Back then we lived on a small holding called Oak Haven, deep in the countryside. The houses there seemed like isolated islands, lost between cornfields and thick woods. We had a few chickens, 2 scrawny goats, and a sadness that had settled into our bones like dampness from a storm. I was just 8 years old, and my brother Thomas was 13. He was always braver than me, more determined, but also more stubborn than an old mule. My father, Arthur Miller, belonged to that kind of man who lived closer to the whiskey bottle than to water. He always came, back from town staggering, with eyes bloodshot with rage, and his belt ready in his hand. My mother, Grace, carried her bruised body like someone carrying an invisible cross. At night I would hear her crying softly, thinking no one could hear her, but how could we not hear her when the walls of our house were as thin as old paper? Thomas and I would look at each other in the darkness, without speaking, but making a silent promise. Someday this would end, and that day came sooner than we imagined. It all started one afternoon, when the sun was beating down like fire on our heads. Mom had served beans with freshly made bread. Dad came home drunk, as always, with his knife hanging from his belt and his gaze lost in some private hell. He had barely crossed the threshold when he was already shouting. He lunged at Mom because, according to him, the food was cold. And then Thomas jumped up. "That's enough, Dad!" He shouted at him with a voice I had never heard from him before, a man's voice in a child's body. My heart leaped into my throat. Dad turned around like an enraged bull. "What did you say, you brat?" "That you should stop hitting my mom, that what you're doing is cowardly." Good heavens, that's when hell broke loose. Dad gave him a blow to the face that knocked him to the ground. I screamed. Mom did too. But Thomas, stubborn as he was, got up and went after Dad. He punched him in the stomach, making Dad spit blood through his teeth. It wasn't a fight. It was a massacre. Dad hit him with his fists, with his belt buckle, with whatever he could find. When Thomas stopped moving, when his body looked like a rag thrown on the floor, Dad stood there, trembling and sweating. He touched him with the tip of his boot. "Damn it! I killed him!" Fear shot through me like lightning. I peed myself, literally. Mom threw herself onto Thomas's body, but Dad pushed her away. And then came the worst part. He went out to the yard, grabbed a shovel, and without a word, went into the woods, carrying Thomas as if he were a dead animal. I followed him without making a sound, my heart in pieces. I hid in the bushes. Dad dug frantically, sweat running down his forehead. I cried silently, clutching the Virgin Mary medallion I always carried with me. When he finished, he dropped my brother's body into the hole and started covering it up. Thomas moved. He moved, I swear to God. I saw him move his fingers, his head. But Dad didn't stop. He kept piling dirt on him. Just at that moment, in the midst of my silent terror, something moved on the other side of the clearing. It was a horse, and on it was a man with a wide-brimmed hat and a look of fright on his face. His name was Mr. Lawrence, but everyone called him Wolf. He lived about 3 miles away, on a farm called Blackberry Creek. He saw everything too, but he stayed quiet, hidden among the branches, watching with wide eyes. He waited for Dad to finish and leave, and then he got off his horse and ran to the spot. I also came out of my hiding place, screaming, crying, "He's alive, Mr. Wolf! My brother is alive." He didn't say anything, just took the shovel and started digging him up. When we finally pulled him out, Thomas was barely breathing. His face was covered in dirt, dried blood, and pure terror. Wolf carried him as if he were his own son and put him on the horse. "Let's go, child. You can't stay here." And so it all began. But that was just the beginning of a story that would change my life forever. The horse struggled forward over the stony path as the night enveloped us without mercy. I held on to Mr. Wolf's waist, trembling with cold, fear, and rage. Thomas lay slumped in front of him, clinging to life by a thread so thin that even the wind seemed capable of breaking it. We didn't speak. The woods were silent too, as if they knew something terrible had happened. Even the crickets had hidden away. All that could be heard was the horse's snorting and the crunching of dry branches under its hooves. Mr. Wolf was not a man of many words. He was a widower with no children, and he lived in an old cabin he had built with his own hands, hidden among the rocks where no one bothered him. No one knew much about him, only that he had a knack for healing animals and had never harmed anyone. When we arrived at his farm, he lifted Thomas down with the care one would use for a broken saint. I got down too, my legs so numb that I fell to my knees on the ground. Mr. Wolf opened the door of his cabin, lit a kerosene lamp, and motioned for me to come in. The room smelled of firewood, dried herbs, and loneliness. There was a bed in one corner, a table with glass jars full of strange things, and a couple of rickety chairs. He placed Thomas on the bed. I went over and took his hand. It was freezing, almost lifeless. His eyes were closed, but his chest rose and fell very slowly, as if he were floating between two worlds. Mr. Wolf leaned over to examine him. He checked his ribs, his forehead, his cracked lips. He clicked his tongue. "They left him like an old rag, child. But he's alive. Barely. But he's alive." I burst into tears. I couldn't hold back any longer. I cried as if I had been crying for 8 days instead of 8 years. Wolf let me cry it out. He served me hot mint tea and left a blanket on the floor. "You're staying here tonight. You can't go back. Not yet." "What about my mom?" I asked through tears. "Nothing will happen to your mom. Your father won't want to make any more noise tonight. But you saw everything. He could hurt you. Don't go back to that house until..." "We're sure," I nodded. I felt a new, different kind of fear. It wasn't just fear of my father. It was the fear that my life had changed forever, that we could never return to a normalcy that, on second thought, hadn't been normal anyway. That night I slept on the floor, listening to my brother's ragged breathing and Wolf's footsteps as he paced back and forth. He went over to Thomas every so often, wetting his lips, wiping his forehead. It was as if this man, whom we barely knew, had suddenly become our only angel on earth. The next morning, the sun came through the window, as if it didn't know what had happened. I got up with swollen eyes and an empty stomach. Mr. Wolf was already outside, grinding coffee with his calloused hands. "Your brother is still asleep. It will take him a while to wake up, but he's better." "Do you think he'll make it?" "With care and faith, yes, but it won't be easy. That boy's spirit is broken." Days passed and we didn't leave the cabin. Wolf went to his cornfield, brought us tortillas, eggs, warm milk. He taught me to make tea with epazote and to heal scrapes with aloe vera. Every night before going to sleep, he would tell me stories from when he was young and roamed the mountains hunting deer. But he didn't talk about what had happened, not once. Until one afternoon, a week later, Thomas woke up. I was washing dishes in a basin when I heard him say softly, "Where am I?" I dropped the plate and ran to hug him. I cried again. But these were different tears. They were tears of relief, of love, of hope. Thomas was alive. You're safe, little brother. You're with Mr. Wolf. He's taken care of us. Thomas looked at me with empty eyes, as if he didn't know who I was. What about Mom? What about Dad? Mom is okay. Dad thinks you're dead. He fell silent. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he turned his face to the wall and murmured, I want him to pay for everything he's done. I froze. I had never heard so much hatred in my brother's voice. That night, Wolf came into the room and looked at both of us. He sat on a chair in front of us, his hat in his hands. Listen closely, kids. What happened can't stay like this. But we have to do it right. No revenge, no foolishness. I saw everything. I know what that man did. When you're strong, Thomas, we'll go to the village constable. But in the meantime, no one must know you're alive. Thomas nodded. Promise. But I swear by the Virgin Mary that one day he will pay for everything he's done to us. And that promise was like a seed planted in my brother's heart. What we didn't know was that, from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. Not for us, not for my father. Time passed slowly like thick honey. Every day in Mr. Wolf's cabin was a mix of silence, care, and glances filled with unsaid things. Thomas recovered little by little. First he could sit up in bed, then walk a few steps, and within a month he was wandering around like a lost soul, thin with dark circles under his eyes, but with a determination in his gaze that he didn't have before. I would see him at night, sitting by the window, staring into the darkness, as if he could see through the hills to the house where he was buried alive. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was with a different, deeper voice, as if pain had made him grow up suddenly. Meanwhile, Mr. Wolf and I did our best to keep busy. He taught me to read better. He made me write in an old notebook. He said it was good for the mind and for not going crazy with so much silence. He also taught me to milk the goat, to identify medicinal plants, and to make tortillas from the mesa dough. But I couldn't stop thinking about my mom. Was she okay? Did she know that Thomas wasn't dead? Had my father hit her again? These questions gnawed at me like termites in wood. One day, Wolf found me crying behind the corral. I sat on a stone, my braids all undone and my knees scraped from running around in the bushes. I can't take it anymore, Wolf. I don't know anything about her, not a sign. Don't cry, child, he said, sitting beside me. First thing tomorrow, I'll go to the village. I'll see how your mother is. I promise to bring you news. That night, I didn't sleep for a minute. Neither did Thomas. He lay with his eyes open, as if waiting for a shot that never came. He was afraid Wolf wouldn't come back, but he did come back, just as the sun was peeking over the mountains. We saw him appear in the distance, with his worn hat and tired walk. I ran to him as if he were my own grandfather. And Mom, is she okay? Did you see her? Wolf stroked my head and knelt down to look me in the eyes. Your mom is alive. She's bruised, but she's still standing. She doesn't know you're here. She thinks you went with a relative, and she thinks they buried Thomas. I felt a knot in my chest so tight I could barely breathe. What about Dad? Your father has been quiet since that night. He hasn't talked about the matter again. He's wandering around the farm like a lost soul, but he doesn't suspect that someone saw him. What if you report him? You saw everything. Wolf looked at me sadly. Without proof, it's useless, Rose. He can say it was an accident, that the boy hit himself, that he ran away. But if Thomas appears and tells everything in his own voice, then yes, then we can take him before the constable. That day, Thomas heard everything, and it was the first time he said firmly, "I'm ready." "No, boy, not yet," Wolf replied firmly. "Are you alive?" "Yes, but you're not strong yet. You need to be whole, with a clear head. We'll wait a little longer." Thomas didn't say anything. He just clenched his fists. In the days that followed, he began to write down what had happened. He did it in Wolf's notebook, detailing every blow, every word, every step Dad took, carrying and burying him. He asked me to do the same, from my point of view. We wanted to make sure that when the time came, we wouldn't miss a single detail. Wolf helped us organize our thoughts. He said that a disorganized testimony got lost in the noise. It was during one of those nights of writing that Thomas came up to me and said something that stayed with me forever. "You hate him too, don't you?" I stayed silent. I didn't know how to express what I felt. "I don't know if I hate him, Thomas, but I do know I'm not afraid of him anymore." He looked down. "I do hate him, and I'm not ashamed to say it. I hate him for what he did to me, for what he did to Mom, for how he stole our childhood." I hugged him. He was so thin that I felt his ribs like dry sticks. "You weren't born to hate. Don't let that poison you," Thomas didn't answer. But that night he dreamed of my father. He woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. I ran to him, hugged him, and he started crying like he did when he was a child. I saw him again. He was throwing dirt on my face, and I couldn't breathe. Wolf heard him from the next room and came in with a glass of water. "It's normal, boy. Memories don't fade easily. But you'll see, one day, you'll wake up without that fear. That day has to come soon, because I can't take it anymore. And that day, without us knowing it, was closer than we thought." At dawn, a municipal truck arrived at Wolf's farm. The constable came with his dusty uniform and straw hat. He was accompanied by 2 armed men. "Mr. Lawrence?" the constable asked from below the horse. Wolf came out to meet him. "What can I do for you, constable?" "Someone from the village came to say you're hiding a missing boy." I heard everything from inside. Thomas did too. We looked at each other in silence. We knew this moment would come, but not so soon. Wolf lowered his voice. "Come in, constable. You need to hear a very serious story and see with your own eyes what your people can't imagine." And with that, the door to the past opened again. This time with witnesses. My heart was pounding so hard I felt it would leap out of my mouth. The constable got out of the truck with a stern look, surveying everything like someone who already expected a lie. He was with 2 armed men, one with an old shotgun and the other looking like he didn't even know why he was there. But the one in charge was him, Constable Ernest Vega, a man known for being tough but fair. Wolf received him respectfully, hat in hand, showing no fear, only respect. "Before you say anything, Ernest, you need to hear something very serious. Come in." The constable looked him up and down with suspicious eyes. "And these rumors, Wolf? What are you hiding in your cabin? A truth that hurts, but can no longer stay buried." At that moment, Wolf motioned for us to come. Thomas was behind the door, trembling. Not from fear of the constable, but from what coming out meant. It was like telling the world, "Here I am. They didn't kill me, and I know who tried to." I squeezed his hand. "It's time, brother." He nodded. We came out together, and when the constable saw us, his eyes widened as if he had seen a ghost. "That's not..." "But you're dead, boy." Thomas straightened up with the most confident voice I had ever heard from him in my life. "No, sir. I'm alive. But my father buried me believing I was dead." The armed men looked at each other, confused. The constable came closer, looked at Wolf, then at me, then at Thomas. "You'd better explain this to me. Everything. From the beginning." We sat down, the four of us, in Wolf's small living area. My hands were sweating, my legs tense. Wolf took out the notebooks where Thomas and I had written what we remembered. The constable began to read, first with a frown, then with increasingly wide eyes. "Is this true?" he asked after a while, his voice lower. "Your father beat you unconscious and then buried you?" Thomas lifted his shirt and showed the scars. He still had purple marks on his ribs and a poorly closed wound on his head. "He left me there in a hole, like a dog. He thought I was dead, but Mr. Wolf saw everything, pulled me out of the ground, and saved me." Constable Vega ran his hand over his face. His face was pale. "Did you see everything, Wolf? Are you willing to testify?" "Yes, sir." "I saw everything from the woods. I hid. When the beating started and when that wretch buried him, I waited for him to leave, and then I dug him up. The child was still breathing. The constable was silent for a long time. Then he stood up. This is serious, very serious. But I need the boy to give his official testimony. You too, Rose. And you, Wolf. Let's go to the precinct." Thomas became nervous. "What if he finds out I'm alive? What if he comes for us?" "He won't lay a hand on you, I swear on my mother. If that man did what you say, he'll rot in prison." Wolf nodded. "I'll go with them. I won't leave them alone." They put us in the truck. I was trembling. The road to the precinct seemed endless, even though it was only about 25 minutes. Thomas didn't say anything, just breathed deeply and clenched his fists as if he were about to go to war. When we arrived, they took us to an office where there was a recorder and a typewriter. A kind lady brought us coffee and bread. I couldn't even swallow. Thomas went first. He was in there for almost 2 hours. He told everything with a precision that surprised even me. He didn't cry. He only raised his voice when he spoke about Mom, when he described how he saw her bloody, with cracked lips and eyes emptied of hope. Then it was my turn. My hands were sweating, but I said everything as I had written it. I didn't leave anything out. I told how I followed Dad into the woods, how I saw him dig, how I heard him say he had killed his son. Finally, Wolf went in. We listened from outside. His voice was deep, firm, without hesitation. He didn't add drama or lessen the seriousness. He just told the truth, as a witness, as a savior, as a just man. When he finished, the constable came out with the papers in his hand. "This is more than enough. We're going to find that wretch." They took us to a safe house near the center of the precinct. They said it was better not to go back to the small holding yet, that we had to wait for him to be arrested. That night, no one slept. Not Thomas, not Wolf, not me. Fear returned with every shadow, with every step outside the door. But at dawn, the news arrived. A group of police officers went to Oak Haven. They surrounded my father's house. They found him drunk, asleep on the porch. When they told him his son was alive and had reported him, he was speechless. He didn't deny anything. He just lowered his head. "He's alive?" he repeated as if in an echo. "I thought he was dead." They handcuffed him without resistance. They put him in the patrol car and took him directly to the regional prison. When the constable returned and gave us the news, Thomas was silent. He wasn't happy. He didn't cry. He just said, "I never want to see him again." The constable looked at him with respect. "You don't have to, boy. You did what you had to do. Now it's our job." And that's how one part of that wound closed. But what came next was just as hard, because even though the body heals, the soul is left with scars that burn on the quietest nights. What no one imagined was how my father's story would end. Not even us. Because fate sometimes collects what one sows, but it does so in ways that even God doesn't forgive. The news spread like wildfire. Arthur Miller, the most feared man in Oak Haven, had been arrested for trying to kill his own son. People couldn't believe it. Some said it was a lie, just drunkard's gossip. Others, those who knew my father closely, just looked down and muttered, "It was about time." But what no one knew, not even us, was what was going to happen inside the prison. We were still in the protected house in the precinct, trying to catch our breath. Thomas barely ate. He spent his time looking out the window, as if there was something waiting for him out there, or as if every shadow could be a memory of that night. I wondered every day about Mom. The constable had sent a couple of officers to see her. They told her that Thomas was alive and that we were safe. She fainted when she heard it, cried as if her soul had left her, and kept asking for forgiveness. We wanted to see her, but it wasn't safe yet. The atmosphere in the small holding was tense. Many were friends of my father, and although they knew he was violent, they didn't like someone airing their dirty laundry, as they said. It was the third day after the arrest when Constable Ernest Vega arrived with a pale face and a broken voice. He knocked on the door of the house where we were and asked to speak with us. "Kids, I need you to sit down." I felt a chill. Thomas crossed his arms and stood still like a stone statue. "Your father died this morning." I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Thomas didn't blink. "How?" I asked in a voice barely audible. "They killed him inside the prison." There was a heavy silence. "Who? Why?" asked Wolf, frowning. The constable lowered his voice. "When he was admitted, one of the inmates recognized his last name. It turns out that years ago, Arthur had beaten a man in a bar, leaving him paralyzed. That man died shortly after, and his brother, who is now in prison, never forgot it. He waited for him, and last night, along with other inmates, they beat him. He didn't survive." I covered my mouth with my hand. I didn't know whether to cry, scream, or stay silent. "And you think that's justice?" Thomas blurted out, his eyes blazing. The constable looked at him sadly. "I don't know if it is, son. But I do know that the man who hurt you can never touch anyone again. Not you, not your sister, not your mother." Thomas lowered his head. He didn't shed a single tear. He just said, "He left without asking for forgiveness, without looking at what he did." I sat on the floor, my legs weak. Mr. Wolf stood looking out the window, as if searching for answers in the sky. That night was strange. The silence felt different. It wasn't fear. It was something more complicated, like a mix of relief and sadness. Because even though we knew Dad couldn't hurt us anymore, his death didn't erase what we had lived through. It didn't unbury the childhood he stole from us. "Do you miss him?" Thomas asked me, lying on the cot next to mine. "I don't know. I miss having a good dad, one we never had." He nodded. "Sometimes I wish I could hate him more, but I have nothing left." Days passed. The constable arranged for Mom to come see us. When she came through the door, in her worn dress and eyes full of tears, I ran into her arms like when I was little. She smelled of firewood, corn, and accumulated pain. The three of us hugged as if we wanted to glue our broken pieces back together. "My boy, my girl. Forgive me for not protecting you." "It wasn't your fault, Mom," Thomas told her. "He had us all tied up with fear." We stayed in each other's arms for a long time. None of us wanted to let go of the others. It was as if by touching each other, we could convince ourselves that we were still alive. Mom stayed with us for a few days. The government offered her help to move to another town, far from the farm, to start over. We accepted. No one wanted to go back to that house or see the walls full of dark memories. Mr. Wolf suffered the most from our departure, although he didn't say it in words. I know he grew fond of us. He cared for us, as if we were his own flesh and blood. The morning we left, he stood by the truck, his hat in his hand. "This is always your home. Even as the years pass, I'll be here, with hot coffee and kind words." "Thank you, Wolf," Mom said. "We'll never forget what you did for my children." Thomas hugged him tightly, his eyes closed. He didn't say anything. Sometimes silences say more than 1,000 words. And so we left, heading to another town, with a new last name to protect us, and with scars that couldn't be seen but that ached with every anniversary, with every sound of a belt, with every long shadow in the night. That day I understood something that would stay with me my whole life. Sometimes justice comes late. It comes dirty. It comes broken. But it comes. And sometimes, as in our case, justice has the name of a good man. His name is Wolf. What comes next, what happens after all that, is the hardest part. Learning to live, learning to heal, learning not to be afraid. But that is also possible. We left the village on a cloudy morning, without looking back. The government truck took us along dirt roads between hills and ravines, until we reached a little place called Santa Lucia del Camino, a village hidden among mango and coffee orchards. No one knew us there. No one knew what we had lived through, and that was like being born again. They gave us a simple house, adobe walls, a tile roof, and a large yard where everything we had never had could fit. Silence, peace, and a little bit of hope. It was loaned by a social services organization while Mom found work. The first few days were strange. We walked slowly, as if the ground were new, as if we were afraid that around the corner my father would appear with his belt buckle in his hand and hatred in his eyes. We slept little. Thomas had nightmares. I did too. Mom would get up at midnight to light a candle, praying softly, as if her faith could scare away the ghosts. But little by little, we started to breathe easier. The streets were quiet, the neighbors respectful. Mrs. Josephine, a woman with more wrinkles than a dry ear of corn, was the first to welcome us. She brought us a plate of red enchiladas and a jug of hot corn drink. "God bless you, children. We all carry something here. Don't feel alone." Thomas smiled at her for the first time in days. The first big change was seeing Mom smile without fear. She started selling tamales in the square on Sundays. She made them with banana leaves and tomatillo sauce, just like her grandmother taught her. People lined up to buy them. She would have me count the change and send Thomas for the masa dough. Thomas, he was a different story. At first, he isolated, himself going to the hill with a notebook and a pencil. He spent hours sitting under a tree, writing. I never knew exactly what he wrote. One day I asked him and he said, "I'm organizing my head. There are things in here that I don't want to explode." I worried that he would get stuck in the past, but I understood that everyone heals in their own way. It was a high school teacher who took notice of him. Mr. Samuel, a man with a calm voice and piercing gaze, read one of his writings when Thomas accidentally left it on a bench. "Did you write this?" he asked him the next day. Thomas lowered his gaze. "Yes, but it's just a draft." Mr. Samuel put a hand on his shoulder. "Boy, you don't just write. You bleed on paper. This needs to be shared." And that's how Thomas began to read in the village's reading circles. he would go with his notebook, in hand, stand in front of adults, young people, and children, and tell stories. He didn't say they were his, but we all felt they were. People listened in silence. Some cried. Others applauded at the end with tears in their eyes. One day a woman came up to him and said, "Thank you, boy. You reminded me that survival is possible." I saw him flourish. Every word of his was like a new sprout in the dry earth of his soul. A year after our arrival, Mom was able to rent a more decent little house with a solid floor and windows with bars. I started attending the village school. I liked studying. I dreamed of being a teacher, of helping girls like me, who had had to grow up too quickly. One afternoon, we received a letter that made our hearts sink. It came from Oakhaven. It was from Mr. Wolf. "My children, not a single day passes without me thinking of you. Everything here is just as quiet, but the woods don't scare me as much anymore. Since you left, it seems faith has returned. The corn grew beautifully this year. The coffee plants bloomed like they hadn't since my Aurora died. You gave me family, even if only for a short time. Keep going. Don't look back. And if you ever feel like you can't anymore, remember how brave you were. I'll always be here waiting. For you, Wolf." Mom cried when she read it. I kept it among my books, as if it were a little piece of home that wouldn't wither. That day, Thomas said something to me that stuck with me. "You know, Rose, I think we survived for something bigger than just living." "Like what?" I asked. "To bear witness, so that no one else has to go through what we went through in silence." And he fulfilled it. Soon after, Mr. Samuel helped him publish a small handmade book with his stories. They sold it in the square, with a photo of a cracked tree on the cover. It was called Seeds of Silence. People started telling their stories too. Women, children, quiet men who had swallowed blows and guilt for years. Thomas's book opened doors we never imagined. But even though life was starting to take on a different color, there were difficult days. Days when the air felt heavy, when memories came back like hidden knives. One afternoon, while we were helping, Mom with the masa dough, I asked Thomas if he had forgiven Dad yet. He fell silent. "I don't know if I've forgiven him, but I don't carry him with me anymore. And that's already something." I nodded. Nothing more was needed because forgiving, I understood that day, is not always about letting go of the other person. Sometimes it's about letting go of yourself, so you can walk without stones in your soul. And so, between sacks of flour, books read aloud, and afternoons of tamales, we gradually rebuilt what had once been so broken that we thought it couldn't be fixed. Santa Lucia del Camino wasn't a paradise. It had its shortcomings, its shadows, its forgotten corners. But it also had what we needed most: ground where the earth could finally bloom again. 2 years had passed since we left the hell of Oakhaven. 2 years in which we learned to breathe differently, to live without sudden scares, to trust life little by little. But there are things that, even if you bury them, even if you cover them with flowers, with warm bread, or with well-written words, still pulse. They don't go silent. They just settle into a corner of the soul, and there, in silence, they wait for their moment. It was a rainy afternoon when everything started to stir. I was in the kitchen, kneading dough for the gorditas we would sell in the square the next day when Thomas came in soaked, with his notebook in his hand and his eyes bright. "Rose, they invited me to speak in the city at a conference on domestic violence. They want me to read my story." My hands were full of dough, and I was trembling inside. "Your whole story? Just like that?" Just like that. With names, with dates, with everything. My first impulse was to tell him no, not to expose himself, not to stir that up again. But I held back because I looked at him and knew it wasn't for fame or recognition. It was for justice, a justice that went beyond prison or the grave. It was for all those who hadn't been able to speak. Mom didn't say anything at that moment. Her eyes just welled up and she calmly continued grinding the chili. But that night, when everyone was asleep, I heard her praying louder than ever. Dear God, give him strength. Protect him so he doesn't break again. The conference was held in a large school with high ceilings and walls full of colorful murals. Mrs. Josephine and Mr. Samuel accompanied us. Wolf couldn't come, but he sent a letter blessing every word that came out of Thomas's mouth. There were a lot of people, women with their children, teachers, students, even police officers in plain clothes. When my brother was announced, a silence fell so deep that it felt like the air had stopped. Thomas walked to the stage with his worn notebook in his hands. He took a deep breath, looked at the audience, and began. My name is Thomas Miller. I am 17 years old, and when I was 13, my own father left me for dead and buried me alive. The people were petrified. Some thought it was a metaphor until he started telling the story in detail. The sound of the belt buckle, Mom's screams, the silence in the earth. I didn't die. A neighbor saved me, a man who had the courage that others didn't. And since then, I decided that one day I would speak up, because silence kills too. There were tears, many tears. A tall man in a checkered shirt covered his face with his hands. A little girl hugged her mother tightly, and I just cried silently, squeezing Mom's hands, watching my brother become something bigger than his story. After the reading, people came up to hug him, to thank him, to tell him their own pains. It was a long, heavy line, full of confessions. My dad used to burn me with cigarettes. They locked me in the basement with the rats. I reported him, but no one believed me. And every word was an echo of what we had lived through. But now we weren't alone. Days later, a local newspaper published an article about the conference. It attracted so much attention that a television channel asked to interview Thomas. He refused. I don't want fame, he said. I don't want my story to be used for morbid curiosity. I speak so that someone else dares to live. But that visibility brought something unexpected. One day, returning from school, we found a yellow envelope without a return address on the door of the house. Inside was a handwritten letter in shaky handwriting. Thomas, I am the son of the woman your father violated in 1981. I never knew her name, only that she was young and lived in the neighboring smallholding. My mother died during childbirth. My grandmother raised me, and she always told me I was the son of the devil. I read your story. I cried. It hurt me, but it also gave me strength. You are not alone. I am also the child of a wound, R. A knot formed in my throat. Thomas was in shock, reading and rereading the letter, as if he wanted to understand everything that lay behind those few lines. How many more are there? He asked softly. More than we can imagine, I told him. And there again we understood that my father's story wasn't just ours. It was a long shadow that had left children without fathers, women without voices, and unhealed wounds. Over time, Thomas, along with Mr. Samuel, organized a group called Voices of the South, where young people and adults could tell their stories, write them down, and share them. They met on the second Saturday of each month at the municipal library. I helped serve coffee and sweetbread. People came from many places. A woman who had escaped from her abusive husband after 25 years of marriage. A boy who had lived on the streets since he was 10. A little girl who could barely speak of her fear, but who drew as if her soul poured out into every stroke. And so, little by little, we built something beautiful with the broken pieces. One day, while we were hanging posters for the group in the square, Thomas came up to me and said, "Remember when I thought everything was lost? Of course, we cried every night." Well, now I know that nothing is lost if you decide to fight. Maybe not to change the past, but so that the future doesn't resemble it. I hugged him. He was taller than me, stronger, wiser. But in my heart, he was still the child who was buried alive and decided to be born again. And yes, the voices of the past don't go silent, but now they sing. Time passed as it does in villages, slow on the clocks but fast on the skin. We were no longer the same children who arrived trembling at Santa Lucia del Camino. At 16, I was preparing to take the entrance exam for the teacher's college, with the firm dream of becoming a teacher. Thomas, almost 19, had become a reference point in the region, where before he was seen as the boy with the sad story, now people sought him out to organize forums, help with reports, and accompany processes. But with all that we had healed, there was a place that remained locked with a strong padlock and a lost key. Oakhaven. That piece of land where we were born, where everything broke, where my brother was buried alive, and where Mom almost died of sadness. We never went back. We didn't even talk about it much, as if it were a cursed place that you only mentioned softly so as not to wake the dead. Until one day we received another letter, but this time, it wasn't from someone seeking comfort. It was from someone calling us to return. Thomas and Rose. "I am writing to you from the community. A month ago, Mrs. Teresa, the neighbor who lived across from your house, passed away. In her will, she stated that you are the legitimate owners of Arthur's plot of land and that if you wish, you can return to see it one last time before the woods claim it. No one has lived there for years. The house is falling apart, but the land is still giving. You will know if it is time to return. Wolf." I read the letter aloud. Mom was speechless. Her hands were clasped, her lips trembling. Thomas didn't say anything for a long time. Then he got up, went for an old notebook, the one he had kept since we left the farm, and said, "It's time." The road back was like entering a strange dream, one of those that hurt and calm you at the same time. The curves of the hill, the old trees that seemed to recognize us, the smell of mesquite mixed with wet earth. Everything spoke to us without saying a word. When we arrived at the farm, the first thing we saw was the dilapidated gate, the same one Dad used to chain shut every night. The chain was gone, only the frame remained, hanging like an old jaw. The house. My God, the house was nothing but dust and silence. The roof had holes, the walls were covered in vines, and at the entrance, a twisted mesquite tree grew, seemingly embracing it. Thomas didn't go in right away. He stood there, contemplating everything, with a mixture of fury and nostalgia. I went in. There was the table where we ate in silence, the corner where Mom sat to pray, the shadow where Dad hung his knife. Everything was covered in cobwebs and dry leaves, but it was intact in my memory. Thomas went into the room where we slept. He touched the worn wooden bed, knelt down, and picked up a little stone we had painted green with watercolors as children. "Remember?" he said with a cracked voice. "We buried it there when we made our promise." "We'll never let him take our spirit," I finished, feeling the tears welling up. We went to the yard. There was the well, the old tire swing, and beyond that, the patch of woods where everything happened. the place where my father dug a hole, where he left his son's body, as if it were trash. We approached slowly. Wolf had left a wooden cross there, simple, without a name. It just said, "Here Fear died." Thomas knelt in front of it. He cried softly. I knelt beside him and took his hand. Mom came over afterwards, a rosary tangled in her fingers. She didn't say anything. She just closed her eyes and prayed. We spent the afternoon cleaning up a bit. We burned dry leaves, removed fallen branches. Thomas ventured into Dad's old room. He opened a chest that no one had dared to touch. It was full of old papers, receipts, photographs, and a black notebook. He opened it carefully. Inside were notes in Dad's handwriting, nonsensical things. Others that seemed like confessions. On one page, written in smeared ink, it said, "I wasn't born bad. My own beatings made me hard. But when I see my children sleeping, I feel it's too late to change. I hope someday they forgive me for what I couldn't be." Thomas closed the notebook. He didn't say a word. He just stood up and put it in the fire. The pages burned slowly, as if they were reluctant to go. That night we slept at Wolf's house. He had more gray hair, more wrinkles, but the same kind eyes. He made us pot coffee and freshly made tortillas. "Coming back is always about staying," he told us. "Sometimes you just need to look back, make peace with the ghosts, and keep going." "What if the land doesn't yield anymore?" I asked. "If you plant with your soul, even stone will bloom," he replied with a smile. Before we left, Thomas planted a cypress tree on the land where he had almost lost his life. He dug the hole himself, placed the root gently, watered the earth with water and a handful of tears. "This will grow, and every time someone passes by here, there will be something beautiful where there was once pain." We returned to Santa Lucia, different, lighter, as if we had finally dropped a sack we had been carrying on our backs since childhood. Mom went back to her tamales, I to my studies. Thomas continued writing, but with a different tone. His words no longer bled, they blossomed. And so we learned that you don't heal by forgetting. You heal when you have the courage to look pain in the eye and tell it, "You don't rule me anymore." Because returning to the place where everything broke and leaving there standing is also a form of rebirth. The cypress tree that Thomas planted on that piece of land, where his body was once buried between fear and silence, began to sprout. Not even a month had passed since our return to Oak Haven, when we received a photo in the mail. It was Wolf, with his toothless smile, standing next to the little tree that was barely a few inches off the ground. "It's taken root," he wrote. That phrase echoed in my mind for days because, yes, we felt that something in us had finally taken root. A new root, healthy, free from the poison that had once inhabited us. But taking root also means staying, and although my heart was at peace, there was a part of me that felt something was still missing, like an outstanding debt, but with the future. It was Thomas who said it one night, drinking coffee with Mom under the stars. "I want to work with the children from the Oak Haven farm." "With them?" Mom asked, raising her eyebrows. "With them and with the children here too. I want to start with what no one ever did for us. Listen to them." Thus was born what he called Seeds of Silence, a small workshop of writing, art, and conversation for children living in communities where violence was silenced or disguised with prayers and warm tortillas. Mr. Samuel, the teacher who had supported him from the beginning, was the first to help him. They partnered with a civil organization and got a couple of blackboards, donated books, and an old tape recorder that only worked when you gave it a gentle tap. They started in Santa Lucia once a week. On Saturday mornings, the library yard filled with laughter, colors, crumpled papers, and painful questions. Is it wrong for my dad to yell at my mom? My uncle touches me, but he says it's a secret. I want to be like you, Thomas, to write things that get what's inside me out. I wanted to hug them all. Sometimes I did. Sometimes I just cried with them and told them, "You are not alone. You are not crazy. It's not your fault." Thomas had a gift, not just for writing, but for listening without judgment, for making every child feel that their pain was valid, that their words mattered, that silence wasn't their only option. One day, after a tough session with a boy who came from a home where his stepfather locked him in a shed, Thomas sat beside me with watery eyes. "What if what we're doing isn't enough? What if we don't reach them?" I took his hand. "You reach just one, brother. One who lives, who is saved, who speaks. With just one, you've worked a miracle." Rumors of what we were doing reached Oak Haven. To our surprise, not with rejection, but with curiosity. One day, Wolf sent us a note. "A group of mothers here want you to come. They say they have children who need to release what they are carrying. That now they know silence hasn't protected them from anything." Mom's face lost its color when we read it aloud. "Go back to work there?" she asked. "To the land that almost swallowed you?" But this time there was no fear in our answers, only conviction. Now we are the ones planting. They don't bury us anymore. The first session in Oak Haven was in the same little rural school where I learned to read, between shouts and blows at home. It was an old classroom with dusty blackboards and benches carved with hearts and scribbles. The children arrived shyly. Many were children or grandchildren of people who knew our father. Some even remembered him. "Are you Arthur Miller's son?" a thin little girl asked, her eyes bigger than her body. Thomas knelt down to her height. "Yes, but I am not him." She smiled shyly. "That's good. You speak nicely." That day we heard stories that seemed to come from our own memories. A boy who slept in the barn to avoid hearing his parents' fights. A girl who wet the bed every night, since her uncle came into her bed once. A teenager who cried, remembering how his mother stood in front of his father's knife to protect him. And Thomas listened to them, had them write, draw, invent worlds where there were no shouts or leather belts. "No one judges you here," he told them. "Here you can release what burns inside you." Each session was a kind of service, but without religion. Just faith in words, in tenderness, in the possibility that children could be children again. I helped them write letters they didn't know who to address. Some were for their parents, others for God, others for themselves. One boy wrote, "Dear future me, I hope you're happy. Things are rough here, but I'm fighting like a cat on its back." We all cried, even Mr. Wolf, who had come to see how what he himself helped unearth was blossoming. "Look at all that came out of that hole," he said. "Even poetry. Over time, seeds of silence spread to other villages. It became a breeding ground for artists, advocates, storytellers. Some of those children, now teenagers, started doing street theater with their stories. One of them, Stephen, said one day in front of the whole village, "I am a child of fear, but today I come to say that I do not want to pass on that fear to anyone else." And we applauded, cried, hugged, because when a child can speak, they can be saved. One afternoon, while organizing boxes of donated books, Thomas showed me a crumpled piece of paper with something he had written that very morning. He handed it to me in silence. It said, "I was buried by a broken man. A good man unearthed me. My sister, a cypress tree, and words saved me." I hugged him tightly. "And what comes next?" I asked. Now it's time to plant more trees and make sure no one else has to write from the grave. And there I understood that this was our mission, not just to speak, but to open paths, break chains, plant light where there was once only shadow. Because the land that one day wanted to swallow us is now the one that holds our roots. The cypress tree that Thomas planted that afternoon in Oak Haven was now a young tree with branches reaching up like arms to the sky and green leaves whispering in the wind, as if the earth itself were telling stories. Every year it grew taller, as if it knew that right there, at that spot in the woods, pain had clashed with life and lost. Almost 5 years had passed since we first left the farm, and what began as a story of hidden pain ended up being a chain of living hope. Not the naive kind of hope, but the kind built with broken hands, with brave words, with hugs given even when arms tremble. Thomas was now a full-grown young man. He had a firm voice, a straight back, and a gaze that spoke of everything he had seen, and even so, he still believed. He was a guide, a brother, a witness. His project, Seeds of Silence, had grown so much that it no longer fit in his shoes. He had formed networks with psychologists, rural teachers, even human rights advocates who came from the capital to learn how so much was done with so little. But he never felt like a hero. He always said, "I don't work miracles. I just listen, and listening is also planting." For my part, I managed to get into the rural teachers' college, as I had always dreamed. I studied during the week, and on weekends I continued helping with the workshops. Teaching healed me. Seeing children who had once not spoken a word, now reading their own texts in front of the community, filled my soul. One day, while packing books for a session in a nearby community, Mom sat at the door with a cup of pot, coffee in her hand. She looked at both of us with those tired eyes, now full of light, and told us, "You are my miracle. I thought I had lost you. I thought the blows had extinguished everything. But look at you. You even made the land where you bled bloom." Thomas laughed softly, his hoarse laugh that sometimes reminded me of Dad, but without the venom. "It wasn't just us, Mom. You were also the root." She wiped a tear with her apron. "I just prayed. Sometimes praying is resisting, and resisting is loving," I replied, taking her hand. It was in April, the month of early rains, when something we never thought possible was organized. The first festival of words in Oak Haven. Not in Santa Lucia, not in the city. In that little village that once had neither voice nor echo. The organizing committee, made up of women from the community, asked that the festival be named after Thomas. He immediately refused. "No, please. Give it another name. It's not about me, it's about everyone." So they named it Where Life Begins. People came from nearby villages, from the city, from the most remote farms. They set up tents with books, puppet shows made of paper, tables where children sold drawings with phrases they had learned in the workshops. One said, "Here we no longer shout with anger. Here we speak from the heart." Thomas opened the festival with a brief speech, but one that resonated like thunder in a clear sky. This place, where I once thought I would die, is now a cradle of stories. If you are here, if you ever felt that no one was listening to you, this space is yours. Your word is a seed, your truth is a root. And even though they tried to bury you, they didn't know you were also a seed. People stood up to applaud. Many cried, others hugged. Some older women, the kind who for a time defended my father out of habit or fear, came closer with humility in their eyes. "I didn't know how to ask for forgiveness," one said. The important thing is that now you do know, and you're not keeping quiet, Thomas replied. That day, something happened that we never imagined. In the middle of the festival, a young man in his 20s, tall, dark-haired, with a gaze full of something hard to explain, approached us. He had a notebook in his hands. We recognized him from the letter. It was R, the son of the woman Dad violated in 1981. He looked at us, trembling slightly. Thomas took a step towards him. "Is that you?" The young man nodded. "I came to look you in the eyes, to thank you because your story took away my shame. It made me understand that I am not what he left me, but what I decide to build." Thomas hugged him. I did too. The three of us cried there, among books and children playing with puppets. "You know," Thomas said, "sometimes I think Dad left too many wounds. But if things like this are born from those wounds, then, even if he doesn't know it, he ended up helping us build something good, not by his will, but by our resistance." R gave us his notebook. It was full of poems. One said, "I was born of fear, but I didn't inherit it. My arms no longer tremble, my voice no longer hides, and my soul, even though it has scars, knows it's not alone." At the end of the event, as the sun was setting behind the hills and the cypress tree had already cast its long shadow over the land, Mom came up to us with a calm smile. "See? Every tear, every sleepless night, every prayer, it brought us here." Thomas looked at the tree, then at me, then at the sky. "Yes, Mom, here fear ends, and life begins," I said, completing the sentence as we used to do when we played at finishing each other's ideas. The three of us held hands, a strong, living, clean circle. And as the leaves of the cypress tree whispered softly above our heads, I knew there was nothing left to fear. Because pain didn't defeat us. Because the land that once tried to swallow us now holds us with love. And because love, when it is true, not only heals, it also teaches you to bloom. That year, Seeds of Silence won a national award. The funds allowed us to build a small rural library right next to the cypress tree. We called it the House of Words. On Saturdays, the children would come to read under its shade. Thomas and I took turns telling them stories, listening to them, teaching them that their voices mattered. Wolf, now old but with the same light in his eyes, came to visit us every month. He brought freshly ground coffee and advice that tasted like good earth. He would sit with the children and tell them how he had witnessed a resurrection, how he had unearthed a boy who was now a tree and a word. One day, as we watched the children play in the library yard, Thomas asked me a question that had been lingering between us for years. "Do you think it will ever end? The pain, I mean." I looked at the children, then at the cypress tree, then at him. "I don't think it ends, brother. I think it learns to coexist with other things, with laughter, with hot coffee, with stories told under the trees. And little by little, it gets smaller. It doesn't go away, but it no longer takes up all the space." He nodded. "Like scars. They don't hurt anymore, but they remind you that you survived." That afternoon, a group of mothers from Santa Lucia arrived with a proposal. They wanted Seeds of Silence to expand to more communities. They brought resources, names, contacts. The project that was born in pain was now growing with new hands, with different voices. Thomas listened to them attentively, with that ability of his to make everyone feel that their words were the most important in the world. In the end, he told them something that made me understand how much my brother had grown. This is no longer just our story. It belongs to everyone. I am not the one leading it. It is the story itself that is showing us the way. And so, What began as a desperate attempt to heal became a movement made of broken silences, of outstretched hands, of words that were once buried and now flew free. Because that's what happens when a story is told with truth. It doesn't die. It multiplies. It becomes a seed, a root, a stem, a leaf, a flower, a fruit, and other hands pick it up, plant it again, and again, and again. One day, as autumn was setting in, we returned to the exact spot where my father had buried Thomas. The cypress tree was stronger than ever, with roots spreading across the ground like generous veins. The wooden cross that Wolf had placed was barely visible now, covered by the wildflowers growing around it. Thomas approached the tree, placed his hand on its rough bark, and closed his eyes. "Thank you," he said. "Are you talking to the tree?" I asked, smiling. "I'm talking to everything that saved me. To the tree, to Wolf, to you, to Mom, to the words, even to this land that once swallowed me and now holds me." I came closer. Placed my hand over his, felt the texture of time beneath my fingers. "Do you know what day it is?" he asked me. I looked at him, confused. He pointed to a date carved into the base of the tree, small, almost invisible. It was the day he was buried alive. "Today marks 10 years since I was born again." We sat in the shade of the cypress tree with the afternoon slowly falling over Oakhaven. In the silence, we could hear the voices of the children playing in the distance at the library. Free voices, without fear. Voices growing like the branches of the tree towards the sky. And I understood that this was the real miracle, not just having survived, but having transformed the place of our burial into the site of our resurrection. "Next week, we're going to another state," Thomas said suddenly. "They invited us to take seeds of silence to an indigenous community where many children are living what we lived." "Are you scared?" I asked him. "No," he replied with a smile. "I'm grateful. Every time a child speaks, it's like I'm being unearthed again." As dusk fell while we were returning home, I saw how the cypress tree stood silhouetted against the orange sky, strong and beautiful, like a guardian of memory. And I thought of all the children who were still waiting to be unearthed, of all the stories that had not yet found a voice. "We have work for a lifetime, don't we?" I said to Thomas. "For a lifetime and beyond," he replied. "Because stories are like trees. They keep growing even when we are no longer here." When we arrived home, Mom was waiting for us with hot coffee and freshly baked bread. She had cut her hair. She looked younger, lighter. She was no longer the terrified woman I once knew. She was different, reborn too, like all of us. "How was the tree?" she asked us. "Growing," Thomas said. "Like us." We sat at the table, the three of us, like so many other nights. But this time I felt something different in the air, something I couldn't name but that filled my chest. Perhaps it was peace. Perhaps it was hope. Perhaps it was simply the sweet taste of knowing that, despite everything, we were alive, together, strong as the cypress tree. And as night fell over Santa Lucia del Camino, as the lights of the houses lit up, one by one like earthly stars, I felt that we had finally arrived home, not to a place, but to ourselves. Because home, I understood that night, is not where we are born. It is where we are reborn. And we had been reborn many times. From the earth, from fear, from silence, from unsaid words, from inherited pain. We had been reborn as a tree is reborn after a drought. Slow, stubborn, inevitable. "To the seeds of silence," Thomas toasted, raising his coffee cup, "which are no longer silence, but voice," I completed. And may they never be buried again, Mom added. Outside, the first star of the night appeared in the dark sky, and somewhere, under the cypress tree in Oakhaven, the roots continued to grow, intertwining with the earth, turning the place of death into a sanctuary of life, because that's what new roots do. They transform pain into nourishment, darkness into a path, silence into words. And that is planting hope. My name is Elder Rose Miller. I am 73 years old. And although it is hard for me to walk in the mornings and sometimes I don't remember where I left my keys, there is something that remains intact in my memory. That afternoon when my brother was buried alive and decided, against all odds, to be born again, and with him, we were all reborn.